Hi guys. So, we just got an email today that says that even teachers aren't allowed back in school until the closure is done and everything is clean and whatnot. So, I went to my classroom today and I grabbed some books. I grabbed some of those biographies that you guys saw were on my desk that we're going to do for a writing project when we get back, like on Ruby Bridges, Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Movement, Sacagawea, all of these great people. So I brought some of those that I can read to you guys on YouTube through the next 6 weeks. I also felt like it was really unfair for you guys to not get to finish Martin Luther King Jr. since we were getting to the middle of it, the really good parts. So I'm going to read that on here also so you guys can still finish the rest of the story. Now, the district has said that we're not required to give any homework or any assessments or any grades or anything like that. So I just want you guys to know nothing is going to be graded. So even the packets I gave you, those are just for you to kind of stay busy, to just kind of keep up on things like your math and your reading and writing, but none of it's required. Okay? I would love to see you guys all on iReady if you have the opportunity, and on Prodigy and Extra Math. But if you can't, I don't want you stressing out about it. I don't want you worried about it affecting your grades, because for the next 6 weeks that we're homebound and living it up with Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus, nothing is graded. Okay, so I don't want you guys to worry about your grades at all. I just want you guys to stay home, try to keep up on your reading, try and do some of those websites if you have access to them, and watch my YouTube videos I'll be posting. But nothing is graded, nothing is required. So I just want to put that out there so that you know. Now, with that being said, I'm going to finish, or see how much I can get through, maybe at least a couple chapters of Martin Luther King Jr. So that way it doesn't leave you guys at it, because when we left off, it was a really exciting part of the story. We left off in chapter, oh gosh, we got really far into it too. On chapter 5, A Leader is Born, where it was talking about how Rosa Parks started her bus ban and started sitting on the bus and said, "I'm not moving," and she was arrested. And that prompted the Montgomery bus ban, or the bus boycott, where Martin Luther King and E.D. Nixon decided to say, they said, "We're going to get all these people together, and they're not going to ride the buses anymore. They're not going to use their bus system. They're not going to pay for the buses, and that'll force them to change the rules, because it's not fair that black people have to sit in the back of the bus and white people get to sit in the front." And so that's where we left off, was when he started this boycott, and it was working. There was nobody on the buses. People were carpooling and walking and riding bikes and all of these other great ways to get to work and school, but they weren't using the buses until they decided to make a change. Now, when we left off, Martin's house had just got bombed because he was the leader of this protest, and people were not happy with it. They wanted things to stay the same. They didn't want it to change, and so they were trying to scare him into backing off. And the people around Martin started rallying. They said, "We're ready to fight for you. Tell us what to do, and we're going to go. We're going to make them pay." And Martin said, "No, we're not going to retaliate. We're not going to do anything. We are going to love each other. We're going to love them, and we're just going to keep fighting to make this change a peaceful change." So I'm going to start back at the beginning of the chapter, where it starts with Rosa Parks being arrested. And we'll see how much I can get through before my kids come upstairs and decide to be crazy. So, chapter 5, A Leader is Born. Our caption says, "Here Rosa Parks is seen sitting in a whites-only section on a Montgomery bus." And remember, Montgomery is in Alabama, which is down south, and it's 3,000 miles away from where we are. Probably actually more, because you have to go down south, so it's like a diagonal. So, very different time, very different place from where we are now. Chapter 5, A Leader is Born. On December 1st, 1955, Martin Luther King received a phone call from his friend, E.D. Nixon. "Have you heard about Rosa Parks?" E.D. asked excitedly. Martin didn't recognize the name, and so E.D. explained. Earlier that evening, a black woman named Rosa Parks had left for work at a Montgomery department store and boarded a bus home. Tired from a long day, Rosa was relieved to find an empty seat behind the whites-only section. As the bus filled, the driver ordered her to give up the seat for a white passenger. Like Martin had done years before, Rosa refused. But unlike Martin, Rosa was arrested. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," said Edie. Martin knew right away what he meant. He had been living in Montgomery for a year now, and the two men often spoke about the segregation. They both wanted to do something to bring about changes, and now Rose's arrest had given Edie an idea. "We'll boycott the buses for a day and protest," he suggested. The plan appealed to Martin. It reminded him of Gandhi's nonviolent protest in India. But even so, no one had ever attempted anything like it in Montgomery, and it would take a huge amount of planning. Martin and Coretta had recently had their first child, a daughter named Yolanda. And now, more than ever, Martin felt like he was needed at home. That night, he spoke to Coretta about Edie's plan. "I'm not sure how much time I'd have at home," he said. "This boycott would mean a lot of work." Coretta listened, and then she smiled. "Well, then you better get busy," she said. Martin got very busy, just like others in the Black community. Soon they were printing leaflets and making calls, letting thousands of Black people who used Montgomery's buses know about the boycott. "Don't ride the buses on Monday," they urged everyone. "We're fighting for our freedom." The picture here, the caption says, "Martin Luther King spoke to hundreds of Black people in Montgomery, encouraging them to take part in the boycott in December." It's been a few days without reading out loud too much. My voice is getting tongue-tied. And then I'll show you this picture first. It says, "Protesters in Montgomery wave at an empty bus at the start of the boycott in December 1955. And you can see all of the people in the street and the bus driving by with nobody in it, because all of the people that would have used the bus are standing here watching it go by, so that they're forcing them to make a change. That Monday, Martin woke up Dawn. Shh, these crazy dogs. He paced around his house, trying to hide his nerves. He had no idea if the boycott would work. What if no one took part? And then he heard Coretta shout from the kitchen, "Martin, look outside!" Martin rushed to the window. The morning bus was passing by his house, and it was empty. Hundreds of Black people filled the streets. Some were walking, some were cycling. One was even riding a mule. But no one was using the bus. Martin grinned from ear to ear. The boycott seemed to be working. Martin rushed to his church on Dexter Avenue to meet the other protest leaders. Everyone was so excited, shouting at once. "This could last even longer," someone said. "We'll force the bus company to change its policy," another person shouted. "But who's going to lead us?" And suddenly, they all turned and they looked at Martin. Martin was stunned. He was proud to be associated with the boycott, but he never expected to lead it. "Well, if you think I can," he said proudly, "then I will." Martin took his new position seriously. He organized groups of cars to drive people to work, and each night he gave speeches in his church, encouraging everyone to continue the boycott. Montgomery's buses remained empty for weeks and then months. People walked through the cold winter rain and then the hot summer sun. They walked for their freedom. But the city officials refused to back down. Instead of changing the seating policy on the buses, they searched for a way to stop the boycott. But when they couldn't find one, they turned against its leader. One morning, as Martin was leading a protest meeting, his friend Ralph Abernathy burst through the doors. "Martin," he gasped, "your house, it's been bombed." Martin drove home as fast as he could. As he arrived, he saw smoke rising from the front of his house. His heart pounded with fear. But then he saw them, Coretta and Yolanda. They were safe. Wrapping his arms around her, Martin cried with relief. The Black community was outraged. Within minutes, dozens of them had gathered at the bomb site. Some carried knives, others held guns. Everyone was ready to fight if Martin gave the word. But what happened next amazed them all. Letting go of his family, Martin climbed onto the smoldering remains of his porch and looked down at the crowd. "Love," he shouted. "I want you to love our enemies. We can't let their hate stop us." No one could believe it. Martin's house had just been bombed, his family almost killed. But still, he was calling for peace. The crowd stared at him with admiration and amazement. And in that moment, they'd realized they had a true leader at last. From that night on, Martin doubled his efforts on behalf of the boycott, touring the city and encouraging the protesters with his powerful speeches. "If you have found a correct course," he told them, "you do not retreat. You struggle to win a victory." The city officials increased their efforts too. threatening Martin in private and spreading lies about him in the newspapers. They even tried to stop the protesters from carpooling so that they would have to use the buses. But Martin and the black community refused to break, and those buses stayed empty. And then, as Martin was with the boycott leaders one morning, someone handed him a telegram. It was from the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation. Martin opened it and read what they had to say, and then he read it again. "Well?" someone finally asked. Martin looked up dazed. "The Supreme Court has decided that segregation on buses is illegal," he said. It was all he could do to whisper the next words. "We've won." The picture says shortly after the bombing on his own house, Martin Luther stood on his porch and called for peace. So when it says that the Supreme Court made segregation on buses illegal, that means in the whole country, not just in Montgomery, Alabama, not just in the city or the state or even in the South, but the whole country, they can no longer segregate people on buses. That means black people, white people, any people could sit wherever they wanted on a bus, no matter if their race or their gender or anything. They could sit wherever they wanted in the whole country just because of this one boycott with this one community. And that's how big of a difference people can make. On December 21st, 1956, Martin boarded the first bus ride in over a year. He nodded hello to the driver and then took a seat, directly beneath the whites only sign. It was the best ride of his life. The caption says, "Martin Luther King, wearing the hat, travels on a Montgomery bus in December 1956, shortly after the Supreme Court declared segregation on buses illegal." So if you look, that right there is Martin, the one wearing the hat. And you can see that there's white people in the photo sitting behind some of the black people, which shows that they've made that change with just their boycott, just their actions, had brought about that change in the whole country, which is amazing. Now we're going to see if we can get through chapter 6, which is called "The Struggle Continues." The caption says, "Martin Luther King appeared on the cover of the popular Time magazine in February of 1957. He became such a famous, such an important person that he was on the cover of this magazine." Things began to happen fast after the boycott. News of the protesters' success spread quickly across the country. Suddenly, every black American wanted to hear more from the man whose courage had led the protesters to victory. Martin hadn't set out to be a leader, but now that he'd become one, he never missed an opportunity to campaign against segregation. He wrote a book about the bus boycott named Stride Toward Freedom, and in 1957, he agreed to become chairman of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, a group of senior black ministers who promoted civil rights. The position was based in Atlanta, so Martin waved a sad farewell to Montgomery and returned with Coretta and Yolanda to his old hometown. Remember, Atlanta, Georgia was farther south than, it's not farther south, it's farther east than Alabama. Martin's parents were delighted, welcoming him back into the church with huge smiles. "He's not little Martin anymore," his father told the congregation. "He is Dr. King now." Remember when he went up to Pennsylvania to go to college? That's where he became Dr. King. So you get a doctorate's degree from going to college for a long time. And sometimes you hear doctor and you think of like the medical doctors, but even people who study religion, or people who study even math, or science, or English, any of those people can become a doctor by getting a doctorate's degree, by going to college for a long time and getting that level of degree. So that's why he's called Dr. Martin Luther King, because he's not an actual medical doctor, but he holds that title because of his college education. Super important. It says, Martin's parents were right to be proud. Their son's courage had inspired black people across America to take action of their own. In Arkansas, black students marched through racist mobs to attend newly integrated schools. So integrated schools are schools that have kids from all different backgrounds, like our schools today. You have kids, some that are black, some that are white, some that are boys, that are girls, that come from all different backgrounds, all different families, all different races, and they're integrated together. So a lot of people in the South back then didn't like that idea either. Remember, we talked about in the beginning of this book, there were white schools and white fountains and black fountains, and all these separate things and all this segregation. So when they integrated the schools, they mixed them up. A lot of people didn't like that idea, and so they would be protesting. But Black students in Arkansas marched through those mobs of people, those huge crowds. They were so brave just to go to that new school because they were inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. and the actions that he took that led about such great change. In North Carolina, several protesters sat at white-only lunch counters, refusing to leave until they were either served or arrested. Soon, these sit-ins had spread all over the South, and by the time they reached Atlanta, Martin was ready to join them. The caption says, a Black student sits at a lunch counter in Nashville, Tennessee, in protest against unfair segregation laws. Bundles of napkins have been placed next to him to discourage others from joining him. So you can see he's sitting at this counter, and those bundles of napkins that they've got on the seats, the people in the restaurant put those there so that other people wouldn't join him and they wouldn't sit by him to join in this protest. And these are the same peaceful protests that Martin Luther King is talking about, that Gandhi inspired him to do. They're not hurting anybody. They're not breaking things or stealing things or doing anything bad. They're doing things that they feel they should be allowed to do that should be legal, like sitting at a lunch counter. It shouldn't matter what color of your skin is. You should be able to sit and eat lunch. And so they were doing these peaceful protests to bring about this change without hurting anybody, without making anybody hurt or, anything like that, or breaking anything or stealing things. They were doing it in the right way. On October 19th, 1960, Martin walked into a department store in the middle of Atlanta and sat with other protesters at a whites-only lunch counter. He was arrested within minutes, but it didn't matter. TV cameras had broadcast his protest to the whole nation. His message was clear. He was happy to go to jail in the name of freedom. After a week in a dank jail cell, Martin emerged exhausted. Since Montgomery, he traveled thousands of miles and given his support to dozens of protests. He was happy at last to have some time at home with his family. And by 1963, he and Coretta had 3 more children, boys named Martin Luther and Dexter Scott, and a girl named Bernice Albertine. Martin relished every minute with them and Yolanda, reading together, playing baseball, or just sitting in the yard staring at the clouds. But even at home, they couldn't escape the shadow of segregation. It says police led Martin Luther King from a protest in downtown Atlanta. Even as he was taken to jail, Martin vowed to continue to fight segregation. So you can see the police officers, there we go. You can see the police officers are taking Martin Luther King to jail for sitting at a counter, which is crazy. And he still is happy to go to jail. He's happy to make that sacrifice, to suffer, in order to bring about a larger change. And just like Gandhi did, remember we read that article about how Mahatma Gandhi in India, he went to jail several times. And the only reason they released him is because they didn't want to anger the other people in India and have an uprising on their hands. Because so far they were protesting peacefully, which is what Gandhi wanted. But if Gandhi died in their jails, then it could change and they could get really angry. And they're doing the same thing with Martin Luther King Jr. They're trying to quiet him down by saying, you need to stop these protests and you need to stop doing this, otherwise we're going to put you in jail. And he was willing to do that. He was willing to make that sacrifice so that he could better the country and end segregation. It says one evening, Martin was sitting with Yolanda when an advertisement for a local fair came on the television. Yolanda's eyes lit up immediately. "Can we go, Daddy?" she pleaded. Martin's heart sank. Yolanda was 6 now, and she was growing smarter every day. But there were a lot of things she didn't understand yet. She didn't realize that the fair wasn't open to Black children. So that night, Martin lay awake thinking about the past few years. Protests such as sit-ins had brought about an end of segregation in hundreds of towns across the South. But Black people remained second-class citizens. The time had come to make a bigger statement. It says Martin Luther King and his daughter Yolanda sit on the swing at their home in Atlanta. Chapter 7, Battle for Birmingham. We're getting towards the end a little bit here. I've got 2 more chapters left. So I know I've been on for 20 minutes now, and I know my timer in my kitchen's about to go off. So I'm going to save these last 2 chapters. I'll try and hop on tomorrow to read to you guys. If you didn't get through all of this, don't worry. That's what I love about YouTube. You just press pause. You remember kind of where you're at, and then you can just fast forward through the other stuff and watch it again. Okay? So I'm going to stop at chapter 7 for right now while the story's getting good. Chapter 7 and 8 are the last 2 chapters of this book. It's a pretty short chapter book, but it has so much information in it that's why in class it's taken us so long to get through the first few chapters, because there's so much going on. There's so many characters and different circumstances and a lot of vocabulary for us to understand. So that's why it's taken a while to get to this point and why these last few chapters have gone a lot quicker, because now we're just focusing on the events and the momentum of the story. So I'm going to save the last 2 chapters for tomorrow. If I don't get to it tomorrow, then hopefully the next day. Make sure that you are reading at home. You all should have taken home your library books. You've got books that you've gotten from Scholastic this year, from our sponsors for our classroom. If you go online, there's a lot of YouTube videos where people read the books to you and you can see them on the screen. That's a great way to read also. Especially a good way to read books that are a little bit harder, that are maybe out of your level. You can see the words on the screen and hear them reading it to you, which is really good also. And then after we finish Martin Luther King Jr., throughout these 6 weeks, I'll try to read some of those biographies from our other people. Let's see, I know I brought a ton home, lots of books, because I didn't want to be short-handed. I'm just hoping my dogs don't eat them, because that would be bad. So I brought home a couple books like The Lemonade War and a couple I Survived books that we might get to. I'm going to try and read this one day about Audrey Faye Hendrix. She was the youngest marcher in the civil rights movement like Martin Luther King is going through. Got one about Gandhi, a couple about Helen Keller. Frederick Douglass was an important person in the civil rights movements. Or he was a slave, so this is before Martin Luther King Jr. He was a slave who got his freedom. So this is part of that backstory of why Black Americans were seen as second-class citizens, or seen as not as good as white Americans because they used to be slaves. So that'll give us some little background information. Lots of biographies, chapter book on Jackie Robinson, the first pro baseball player. It's one of my favorite stories, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can. Okay, so that's my timer. I'm going to leave you guys for now, and I will see you again tomorrow. Keep reading. Bye.